So let me welcome everybody to today's conversation on the pooling impact of Scope 3 emissions reporting. My name is Larry Filler, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session today. And this conversation is being brought to you by the Ridesharing Institute, and I'm a member of the board. The Institute was set up over a decade ago to foster the use of carpooling and van pooling internationally through research, advocacy, and education. We have been conducting these conversations over the last year and a half, I think, to focus attention on the important role that pooling can have on both sustainability and the decarbonization of the transportation sector in countries around the world. We have a great group of speakers for you today who will examine ESG and its impact on pooling. As this is an evolving area, we will be hearing about ways to standardize reporting of emission reduction efforts, as well as how two major programs are using emission reduction requirements to increase pooling. As you know, when you did register, I think for this session, you were asked about your level of understanding of ESG. And from what we saw from those who answered the poll, most of you had just some or very little exposure to this. So I want to make sure that everyone has some basic understanding of the environmental component of ESG. And so I'd like to provide some very brief background information. Okay, so let me just briefly give you some background in ESG. As most of you know, ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. And it's this term has been around, or at least the underlying purpose of ESG has been around for a number of years, but it became mainstream only really in 2004 when the UN published a report and they used the term ESG, I guess, in a mainstream way for the first time. And since then, that term has been used. And it refers to a set of metrics used to measure an organization's environmental and social impact, which is of growing importance to financial investors. So what it does is, the concept is to encourage companies to operate more sustainably and more responsibly, not only from a financial point of view, but also from their impact on the environment, the society, and how their company is governed. We've seen recently sort of a number of regulatory bodies that have actually addressed, the reporting of emissions through and other things through ESG. And so we've seen the European Union, the state of California has new law in effect to cover certain companies. And the SEC just, I think about a week ago, issued their final rules to deal with the issue of ESG reporting. And in fact, more and more companies are getting involved in ESG. In one survey that I just pulled, this was a little old now, but from 2022, 90% of companies surveyed by Morningstar found that those companies were either had a plan or were in the process of developing it. So let's focus a little bit on let's focus on the environmental element of ESG. This sort of comes from the GHG protocol, which seems to be followed by everyone, that it's sort of divided the operations of a company, the analysis of the emissions from companies' operations sort of fall into three scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is more what the company is doing under their control. For example, very simply, if they have a building and they have a heating and ventilation system, the emissions from that is something considered to be under their control, and that would fall under Scope 1. Scope 2 has to do with the purchase of energy by a company. So if they buy electricity or fuel from an outside source, the emissions associated with the provider is part of that Scope 2. And then there's everything else, which is all the indirect emissions that are part of a company's operations. And the company operations, which they call the value chain, sort of goes from what's coming into a company, all supplies and things that are necessary for the company to operate, as well as what's happening within the company, and then things that are leaving the company that are going to clients and consumers and so on. So what we're going to do is we're focusing on scope 3. And the reason we're focusing on scope 3 is because scope 3 has been uh, categorized or divided into 15 categories, and certainly not going to go into all of this, but what affects us is employee activities, and they fall into two pots, category 6 and 7, which is business travel and employee commuting. And as you imagine, it's pretty straightforward what business travel and employee commuting is, although there is some overlap between scope 1 and 2 and both business travel as well as employee commuting. One of the things I want to point out about employee commuting I found interesting is that we're all familiar with the travel from home to work. For those employees who are now working from home or telecommuting, that's classified as an optional part of scope 3. And I guess part of it, and maybe we'll hear a little bit later from some of the speakers, of the difficulty of sort of measuring the accumulated impact from an emissions point of view of when you're telecommuting. So the scope 3 itself is really important, and in fact, it can comprise the vast majority in some cases, of a typical business emissions. In some cases, 70%, maybe as much as 90%, particularly for service companies where a lot of the activity revolves around things that employees are doing, to services and so on. The commuting element of scope 3 is, and I'm not sure how well we have a handle on this, but of the research I've been able to do seems they seem to be somewhere between 15 and 20% for some companies, again, service-oriented companies and so on, where the activities of their employees are predominant because of the nature of their operations. But the problem is there is no uniform reporting standards. We don't have any real uniformity in that area. And that's where we turn to our speakers. And Parnika Ray, who will be our first speaker, she is going to address the reporting standards issue. She has her background now, she's worked for over 15 years in international development, urban planning, and architecture in several countries, including France, the US, and India. She is currently with the International Transport Forum, which is part of the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic and Commercial Development, and is leading the project to normalize CO2 reporting in the transportation sector. So Parnika, you can now do your presentation and take over.
Thanks, Larry, for that introduction and for the topic, and for myself as well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I think, Larry, you've already given quite a broad overview of what ESG is. I will touch upon that a little bit more, so there will be overlaps in my presentation. And but before I start, I just wanted to give a quick overview of where I work and what the organization does, and how is this relevant to the topic that we're discussing today. So the International Transport Forum, as Larry said, is as part of the OECD. We serve 66 member countries. That's where our funding comes from. It's the only global platform with a mandate for all modes of transport. We are a think tank. We do policy relevant research and analysis and modeling for our member countries on topics that are of relevance to them in the transport sector. We also have a key publication, which is the ITF Transport Outlook, that comes out once every 2 years, and that has all the key insights of what is happening across all modes of transport that's presented there. But beyond this publication, we also have other projects that we do over the course of a year, every year, based on, again, research questions raised by our member countries, and also by our corporate partnership board. So we also have corporate partners. We have over 33 corporate partners that range from energy companies to mobility companies to logistics companies. And it's quite a broad mix. And they also have certain transport-related questions that they raise for us that we look into. And this topic of reporting GHG emissions has really come from the corporate partnership board, because that's really of interest to them. And it's something, as Larry said, it's becoming more and more important with regulations kicking in. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentation. So the ITF works on 5 major themes, and one of that is decarbonization. And while we've done a lot of work around decarbonization for passenger and freight transport, we've never really looked into emissions reporting. So this is really the first time that we're working on this particular subject. So, but before when we were sort of handed this project about 6 months ago, and we've been looking into that. We've also been looking into the decarbonization work that we've done over the past 10, 15 years to really understand what is going on in this space. But before we get into transport, what we found that there is a rapidly evolving landscape, not just for transport, but for sustainability as a whole right now. So there are the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. There's the Paris Climate Agreement, and beyond the goals, there are the reporting standards and frameworks. And this is where we get into what I call the alphabet soup. There's a lot of acronyms, the GHG protocol, the ISO, the GRI, the CDP. I won't get into, demystifying all these acronyms, but they're basically all different reporting standards and frameworks that exist out there. And some of them are used more than others, and some are globally used, like the GHG protocol, for example. Companies use the Carbon Disclosure Project for reporting, or they use the Science-Based Target Initiatives to establish science-based targets. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But beyond the reporting frameworks, what we have now are the regulations. And there is the SEC in the US, but there is also, I think I'll focus a little bit more on what is happening in the EU space right now, in the European Union. There is the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that is kicking in very soon in the EU space, and which will require certain mandatory reporting from companies, and therefore it is of great interest to the companies. And in fact, quite a challenge also for a lot of companies. So what is the CSRD? It is basically mandatory reporting for large companies listed in the European Union, and also, even if they're not listed, but just of a certain size. The CSRD really requires companies to disclose information on their social and environmental risks, some of the ESG risks that Larry talked about, and this has come into force since 2023, and companies will be reporting on that this year and to be published in 2025. And they have to show how their activities impact people and the environment. Now, one key concept within the CSRD is double materiality. I mean, without getting into too much of the technicalities, to simply say, double materiality assessment is a tool that provides the criteria to determine whether a sustainability topic is a risk or not. And if it is a risk, then it has to be included in the sustainability report. A sustainability matter is material when it meets the criteria defined for impact materiality and financial materiality, or both. Impact materiality is the impact of the activities of a company on people and the environment, and companies need to identify their risks and assess whether those risks are material. Now, for the transport sector, climate transition risk is one of the most material, both in terms of impact and financial materiality, as we can see in the image that I have on my screen. And to understand really the risks, the climate risks, what is required is a GHG inventory. Now, a good, consistent, and transparent GHG inventory helps companies to identify their climate-related risks, and to enable a company also to manage those risks. So a company really needs to know what are their emissions, where those emissions come from, and how they can be reduced. This is, again, a little bit the same of what Larry mentioned before. You know, what is a GHG inventory? What does it have? It has the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which, again, at the scope 1 is the direct emissions, the scope 2 is the indirect emissions from purchased energy, and scope 3 is basically all other indirect emissions in the value chain. And for a good assessment of the risks, according to the double materiality that I talked about, the inventory should include all the scopes. And transport-related emissions will normally be accounted in Scope 1 and Scope 3, for example, in the categories of upstream transportation and distribution, or downstream transportation and distribution, employee commuting, and business travel. Now, as we know, the inventories show that the transport sector is a major contributor of global GHG emissions, and companies are facing increasing pressure from investors and regulators for at times inadequate reporting. So tracking and reporting GHG emissions has become very vital for companies to manage their risks and to meet their net zero targets. The transport sector, as we know, is one of the fastest growing sources of emissions worldwide, and it really includes two segments. That's the freight and the passenger. And it's divided into various modes. There's aviation, there's maritime, there's road, and there's rail. According to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, the largest sources of transport-related GHG emissions include passenger cars, medium and heavy-duty trucks, and light-duty trucks, which also includes like sports utility vehicles, pickup trucks, and minivans. Now, these sources account for more than half of the emissions from the transport sector. The remaining emissions, they come from other modes like commercial aircraft, ships, boats, and trains. Now, again, companies really need to know what their transport-related emissions are and how they can be reduced. The methodologies and reporting, I feel like since we started this project, we've done a lot of consultations with the European Commission, with several standard-setting bodies and agencies, including the EPA, which has the Smart Way program. And what we find as of now is that reporting is kind of more developed for freight than it is for personal transport. And I'll sort of get into that a little bit more next. But before that, so the project that we're working on, it really aims to assess the current state of accounting and reporting practices for the GHG emissions within the transport industry. We aim to identify what are the challenges and barriers to GHG reporting, to demonstrate what are the best practices for accounting and reporting, and also to explore ways as to how to roll out, whatever the existing reporting standards are, how do we best roll these out and how to harmonize reporting. And also to propose through this project a roadmap or a guidance to support GHG emissions accounting and reporting in the transport industry. As I've said, this project is of great importance to the corporate partners that we have, but it is also of importance to the countries that we work for, all our 66 member countries. When I started this project, I really started with doing these consultations that I mentioned, and this is a small, the table on my screen really shows what, the different standards and methodologies that exist and their global coverage, what modes they cover, and what type of instrument it is. Now, without going into too much of the history or details, I'll just say very shortly that that several of these have been developed more than 15 years ago. The EU standard, for example, or the EPA Smart Way program, they started way back in 2004. Then there's the GHG protocol, which is pretty much a global standard that applies to all modes, and it is used by almost all companies for their accounting as a methodology. And more recently, there have been more specific standards like the GLEC framework, which is for logistics, and then which has led to the development of an ISO standard for all modes worldwide. And while they all sound different, what we found till now is that there are actually several of them are aligned, and which I will show in the next slide. But before that, we also did a little bit of a consultation with our companies to understand what were the challenges that they faced around reporting, accounting and reporting their emissions for the transport sector. And while they've given us a long list, I think the three key points that kept coming up was this perceived lack of comparable and consistent reporting standards. Then they talked about data collection, especially primary data from Scope 3. And there's also this, which is to a great extent through fragmentation of legislation between national and supranational levels. So for example, in the EU, there is the EU frameworks, but there's also national legislation. In France, they have a very specific legislation that you can also see in the table. And between global regions, between, for example, North America and Europe, or even Asia. That said, what we found is that there is some harmonization. It's not all as different as it sounds, especially for freight. We see that, that the existing global frameworks like GHG protocol, it is aligned, like the GLEC aligns with the GHG protocol, the ISO aligns with the GHG protocol. Then there are reporting frameworks like the Carbon Disclosure Projects or the Science-Based Target Initiatives, and those are also aligned to the GHG protocol. And they sort of work in close collaboration. Because I've been talking to all these standard-setting bodies. And then lastly, there's also a new initiative coming up from the European Commission, which is called Count Emissions EU. And this is basically an initiative to harmonize all these different reporting methodologies and support the CSRD in terms of reporting. But it's not a new thing. It's pretty much aligned with the GHG protocol, and it is aligned with the ISO. And the GLEC. So there is some harmonization. This initiative will come in this year or next year. So we'll know a little bit more when it is there. But I've talked to the people there, and it's all aligned. So it shouldn't be seen as something different. But despite all of this, what I also found is that there are some gaps. And while the freight aspect is quite well developed, and the reporting is sort of aligned between the several different methodologies and the reporting standards. For personal car use, there is a gap. I mean, so for example, from the Count Emissions EU, we see that it does not take passenger cars into account, which means perhaps employee commuting is not accounted for, which is why I think the conversation today is very interesting for me, because I really want to hear more from my co-presenters in terms of what they think is being done for emissions accounting and reporting for passenger travel, and get some more insights. So I will stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Parnika. That was great. A lot of things in there. We have questions about, we'll have lots of questions later, I think. Anyway, I said there are two major programs we're going to hear about who are using emissions reporting requirements to help foster pooling and other TDM strategies. So I'd like to introduce Ali Clyburn, who's our next speaker. He's the chairman of MobilityWays, the UK's leading climate tech provider, and the founder of LiveShare, the UK's largest carpooling network. He is a recent contributor to the Department of Transport's Transport Decarbonization Plan. Ali?
Thanks, Larry, and thanks, Paul, for inviting me. And thanks to Parnika for a very interesting, I think we have lots to discuss, so I'm looking forward to today. So in the famous words of Truman Burbank, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's been clear to us in the UK that companies having to report Scope 3 emissions is having a dramatic impact on what we're doing. It's leading to much more measurement in this space. And that measurement is highlighting the scale of the commuting emissions. Previous to that, people were very ignorant to the fact that commuting was such a big contributor to emissions. It's leading to much better assessment. And that assessment is showing clear potential to reduce those emissions. And it's also leading to rapid action on behalf of employers now, who are grabbing this with both hands, putting together zero carbon commuting strategies. And importantly for this audience, carpooling comes out very often as the number one thing they should be doing. So I'll go through a few insights from across the pond today. A bit of background from us. My name is Ali Clyburn. I founded the first online carpooling scheme back in 1998, now 26 years ago. I can't quite believe I've spent 26 years in TDM, but I have. And it's been a heck of a journey, and it remains so. We basically spent a long time, many years, discovering the magic dust to make carpooling schemes a success. And I'd say by 2018, 2019, I think we were there. We were absolutely flying. We had so many successful schemes going really, really well. And then along came the pandemic, and our wonderful government told everyone to stop sharing. And so our client needs changed from being one of, we've got full car parks, to one of, how can our business, or for them, how can their business survive? How can they look after their staff? How can they keep people safe? And how can they support this new world of working from home? So we pivoted a lot of our team onto kind of deep analysis of commuting patterns and trying to help our clients to see how their staff wanted to travel back to work now and in the future. And in so doing, we ended up setting up a whole new company called MobilityWays, which focuses specifically on what we're talking about today in terms of how do we measure, report, and reduce commuting emissions. And also why it's important and how to use the insights we've got to really make the case for much more work in this space. You'll see from the graph on the right hand side that the pandemic had a big hit on us, but now that things are getting back more to normal, the lift sharing side's really picking up too, and that's mostly been driven not by parking issues, because very few companies still have full car parking spaces, but most of them are adopting environmental reasons for pushing carpooling, and I'll show you why. So why does all this matter? Why is commuting so important? Well, I don't know about the data from around the world, but in the UK, the commute accounts for over 5% of all emissions. That's 18 million kilos, or 18 billion kilos, or 18 million tons of CO2, which is a big chunk, and it's a chunk that companies can have a role in reducing, as can individuals. There are many causes of emissions that individuals can't influence, and the commute is definitely something that we can all play a role in having an impact on. So how have the changes in reporting impacted on our work? Well, I thought the best way to go through this would be to talk through a recent case study where we've got a client who's pretty much gone through this in record time. Within a couple of years, they've gone from a standing start to having a really big impact. So I thought it was a good case study to talk about. This company employs 1,000 staff, so a quite reasonably sized company. In between 2018 and 2021, they focused, like many other employers, on their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and they managed to reduce them by 58% just in those few years. So big improvements on their Scope 1, Scope 2. But they came to us in 2022 because they were working hard to get their baseline for Scope 3 emissions, and wanted our help with their commuting reporting. They were aiming to get their net zero science-based targets ready and their strategy done by 2023. So they basically had a year to get a handle of this. So what did we do? Well, we've created over the last 5 years this new tool called ACE, which stands for your average commuter emissions level, and a TESOL, which is your total commuter emissions level. And it aims to be as accurate as possible in determining what your total commuter emissions levels are. And it's been adopted now by many, dozens and dozens of huge UK companies, and the NHS has been kind of the standard way that they're now reporting their emissions. I'll give you some more insights, but it basically, rather than simply asking for mode, as most travel surveys do, it also asks each individual for frequency and for distance, and more specific mode information on the type of car, so we can give very accurate individual emissions levels and then aggregate them together to provide a very accurate total emissions. So taking you through the process just quickly. So it starts with a very simple travel survey. Now, as many as you know with surveys, you need a large response rate for it to be accurate. We pride ourselves on designing surveys that's super easy to use and ask all the right questions. So for this survey, they managed to get over 60% of their staff responding, which is pretty impressive. And as you see from this, they had 76% of their staff driving alone. Not only that, for this company in particular, they drive a long way. They've got an average distance of about 30 miles, which is long, and they have a high, so it's not mostly working from home. We take that data and then we feed it into this tool. So for them, their ASOL is this 2167 figure. That's 2,167 kilos of emissions per member of staff. So their goal, as we were setting out, is to reduce that by 5% a year in order for them to hit their net zero target. Just out of interest, 2167 is about 4 times our national average. On average, nationally in the UK, the commuter emits about 500, just over 500 kilos of CO2. So this is a high emitting employer. But what can we do about it? Once we know that they've got lots of people driving, how do we then take the next steps? Well, we don't just ask in these surveys how people travel. We also ask them what they would consider doing. What modes would they consider and what would make them shift behavior? So here are just a couple of examples. One very good question to ask is how else people would travel if they couldn't travel by car that day. And car sharing or carpooling, a third of people basically say they would carpool without really thinking about it. That's what they would turn to straight away. So immediately you've got demand there for carpooling, and where only a few percent were carpooling anyway, why are so many people not carpooling when they could be? We also then ask a question: what would encourage people to carpool to work? And typically, and these are very typical, about 50% of people will say they would carpool if only they could find someone suitable to travel with. And that's when solutions like our lift share scheme come in to basically do that matching process for them. So we know there's a massive latent potential between how many people are currently carpooling and how many could do. So then, having worked that data out, we then use another tool called Commutifi to find out how staff could travel to work tomorrow if they were willing to change. So for this, we take every individual member of staff and we look at all the travel modes available to them. Can they walk? Can they cycle? Can they go by bus? Can they go by train? Can they share a car? Can they come by the company shuttle bus? So we take all the individuals and we plot them on a map, and then we look at each journey and we work out, if all those individuals were to drive alone to work, what would their commuting emissions be? And what's really interesting with this is, even though many people travel short distances to get to work, most emissions don't come from them. In fact, typically about 80% of emissions come from journeys that are too far to walk or cycle. So even if everyone who could walk or cycle does, you've still got 80% of emissions to tackle. And that's where things like carpooling really come in. A lot of focus, particularly in the UK, has gone into walking and cycling, and to a certain extent bus travel. But when you consider that one 50-mile commute emits the same emissions as 51 one-mile commutes, getting that one person to either work from home or to start carpooling, it's going to be a much quicker, better gain than trying to get 50 people to travel differently. So again, that's when carpooling comes in really well. So with this data, we don't just look at carpooling, we look at how many people could walk or cycle within half an hour. We look at how many people can come by public transport, in this case, bus, train, tube. And you see here from this map, the green dots are people that can get there within twice the time it takes to drive. The red dots have a public transport option, but it's going to take them longer than twice the time it takes them to drive. So they're not really going to use it. But when we start then looking at how many people can carpool, the green dots on here have at least 10 people they can carpool within walking distance of their house. The yellow ones have over 4 and the red ones have at least 1. The white dots don't have anyone they can carpool with, but they could be picked up en route. So pretty much everyone could carpool to work, which is why you've got a big opportunity for it. And then when you put all that data together and you work out what emissions you could save as an employer by shifting behavior to all those people who could walk, what could you save? Well, in this case, they could save 3 tons. If they could all cycle, they would save 13 tons. If all the people who could carpool that could carpool, you'd save nearly 400 tons of CO2. So that's where their focus should be. And indeed, that is what they have done. We also have a tool called your ACE-LO, which is your opportunity score. So that if everyone travels the most sustainable way tomorrow, how low could your ACEL go? And when you think they started off with an ACEL of over 2,000 kilos per person, if everyone uses the most sustainable mode tomorrow, there would be 577. So almost a quarter of what they are currently emitting, just by the people who can walk walking, the people who can cycle cycling, the people who can carpool carpooling. So it's not working from home, it's not shifting to EVs. They can take 75% of their emissions off just by shifting behaviors away to more sustainable modes that are available and convenient today. So we then take all of the data from the surveys, the ACEL and the Commute IQ, and we work with clients to set up a carbon commuting roadmap. They set their target, whether it's 2030 net zero, 2040 net zero, and then we work with them to work out where they should be putting their efforts to reduce their emissions as fast as possible to keep in line with their targets. In this case, carpooling came out as being the top thing they should be doing. So we set them up with a lift share scheme. And then if you look at this graph, so they launched a lift share scheme in December 2022. Within a year, they had 500 members, of whom 331 were regularly sharing. And they're now saving nearly £5 million a year on commuting costs and nearly 400 tons of CO2. That's all within a year. And the reason that's been successful is not only because those people can carpool, but because the data insights that we've given to their senior management team have made it a really compelling case for them doing this properly. So they've supported it properly, they've promoted it properly, they've incentivized it properly, and they've got a lot of people carpooling to work. It's been brilliant and really, really quick. But that's just one private company. What we're seeing in the UK now is when you've got big organizations such as our biggest employer, which is the NHS, our hospital service, they in 2022 announced that they were going to include all Scope 3 emissions, specifically in commuting, in its net zero targets. So they have this NHS carbon footprint plus, of which commuting is in there. They've counted that commuting is at least 4% of their total emissions, and they are now each targeting on what they can do to reduce commuting emissions. So we are working with literally dozens of NHS trusts across the UK to help them with that. And there are lots of videos now. There's lots of best practice videos online of us doing just that with the NHS. So that is a very quick summary. Hope I've kept time of what we've been up to. It's been quite a ride the last few years. We pretty much disappeared when the pandemic came along. We pivoted, got into this space of commuting accounting for emissions accounting, and not only has it created a whole new business for us, but it put carpooling right on the map, because carpooling comes out in pretty much every report we do, and we've done hundreds of these now, as the number one thing that companies should get on with, because it is very quick, it's relatively, well, much cheaper than many of the options, and it's something that staff really love when they do it. So that's it for me. I really look forward to the discussion in a bit.
Thank you, Ali. That was terrific. Terrific impacts. Very impressive. Well, we have our North America representative here, Andy Keaton will be next. Andy is the VP for Global Strategy at Commutifi, the company doing business in North America, working with the TDM community to build a smarter and more sustainable transportation future. Andy is a member of the Association for Commuter Transportation Board. He's a certified TDM professional and a recipient of ACT's Emerging Leaders Award. Andy?
Thanks, Larry and Paul, for putting this on, and Rika and Ali for your presentations. I've been on a number of these conversations about commuting emissions, and I think this has been the most interesting one I've been on so far. There's a lot of information coming out in a really positive way. So I really appreciate contributions from everyone here. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about kind of what we're doing as a company in North America. Before I kind of launched, though, I didn't put a slide together. I wasn't sure if Arnika was going to talk about it or not. I do want to mention a couple of things from the United States side, which is when we talk about North America, despite the fact that I'm currently in Montreal, it's primarily driven by the United States. A couple of things to keep in mind. The SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, who regulates, oversees publicly traded companies in the United States, just put out a new ruling on how publicly traded companies need to report on their emissions. And disappointing to all of us on this call, it did not include Scope 3 emissions, so just Scope 1 and 2. That's disappointing. It'd be great to see them match what's going on in the EU. However, I'm not too overly worried. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Where we do see regulation in the United States and North America, primarily it's coming out of California, which tends to lead the way in most of these sorts of environmental regulations. They actually have passed something. It's called the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. It just got signed just a little while ago by the governor there. That will include Scope 3 emissions, including commuting, for most large businesses doing business in California. So ultimately, while the SEC is not going to be regulating Scope 3 for publicly traded companies, a good portion of those publicly traded companies are large enough and doing business in California to be considered, a part of that regulation. So, and this will be by the beginning of 2027. So we're a few years out in the United States from regulation taking hold. But I'm going to talk a little bit here in a second about kind of where I think the market's pushing and where we're coming from, and why, while regulation is incredible and will continue to push forward, we're still in a good spot in North America. So quickly, a little bit about Commutifi. We are a software company based out of the United States and Canada. We help organizations, primarily large corporations, hospitals and universities, build, launch, procure, and manage commute programs that do more, cost less, and lead to sustainable change. We were founded almost a decade ago with a focus on the sustainability piece, really trying to figure out how can we get people to stop driving and really make these sustainable choices during their commutes. And over the years, we realized that cost less piece is really what's still driving the market, at least in North America. There's increasingly the sustainability conversations finally coming into play, really since the pandemic, as Ali was saying, last couple of years. But focusing in on how we can also do that in a cost-effective way is really crucial. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where the market is kind of the market drivers are in the sustainability space. And for me, and from kind of talking to folks in the ESG space in North America, it's coming from the investor side of things. So we're going to be talking a lot about kind of the investor-driven push here. And I want to start by just defining some terms, because more and more companies are throwing these terms out here of, we've got a carbon neutral goal by 2030, net zero by 2050, renewable energy 100, RE 100, or a science-based target, as was mentioned, and I think both previous speakers mentioned, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Because if you see these, they don't all mean the same. They all mean something, and they're all working towards the same goal. The bottom two, renewable energy 100, really is focused on making sure that operations are rely on renewable energy. So less so focused on the transportation space. It has an impact with electric vehicle charging on campus, but other than that, slightly kind of to the side. The science-based targets are really focused in on keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So it's not quite as ambitious as a net zero goal or usually a carbon neutral goal. But the big difference is carbon neutral from net zero. So you'll see these kind of interchangeably, but they actually don't mean the same. So carbon neutral is when a company completely offsets its greenhouse gas emissions. So this means I want to have zero emissions as a company, but I can also just buy carbon offsets to account for some portion of that. We can have a whole separate discussion on the validity of carbon offsets and if they work or not, but clearly net zero, which is about completely eliminating fully the greenhouse gas emissions of that company, is a much more ambitious target. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the NHS in the UK is more on that net zero piece than on the carbon neutral piece, which is really cool to see. So really focusing in on how do we actually eliminate it. And when we talk about commuting, it's much harder to get to net zero than it is to get to carbon neutral because of those long drivers, as Ali was talking about, people driving a long way. Even if we get them into carpooling, public transit, et cetera, we really can never get to net zero. So we're going to be talking mostly about carbon neutrality when we talk about commuting. So corporate sustainability is still big, like I said, even without the regulation. So looking at, and this is coming from a really good website, if not now, when, that's their kind of the climate impact group there. This just highlights how many Fortune Global 500 companies, so around the world, the largest 500 companies, what they are doing in the sustainability space. And you can see this huge ramp up just in the last really 3 years. You see a climb from just about under 30%, 25% in 2020 to now 66% of companies in the Global 500 have a climate commitment. And this is widespread across the globe. So even though you see in Europe driving the way with about it's close to 100%, but greater than 95% of companies across the kind of EU, UK have a voluntary climate commitment, we're not too far behind North America. So even though there's not that regulatory pressure, both Canada and the United States are upwards of 3/4 of those companies with a climate commitment. I think it's important as well to mention that this will likely trickle down to the smaller companies outside of the Global 500. And the reason is that Scope 3 emissions include upstream and downstream emissions. So if you are an organization that's a service provider that's providing a service to a large company, at some point you will be asked to measure your own emissions because it's part of the Scope 3. That said, we're still a little bit away from Scope 3 being kind of the standard. This is a very complicated graph. I tried to simplify it here, but essentially what you see here is this green bit on the left is every company in that Global 500 with a climate commitment of some kind. Pink is no climate commitment. What we see within the group of people with a climate commitment, close to half have both Scope 1 and 2, and then all Scope 3 as part of what they're reporting. So about 23% of all Global 500 are reporting to some degree or to a full degree their Scope 3. Additional 30% to some degree are reporting Scope 3. So we're over 50% of companies with some reporting of Scope 3. Two important pieces here. Obviously, commuting, as we've heard from the other speakers, is part of Scope 3. So for us to kind of for companies to really be taking into account the employee commute emissions. Scope 3 needs to be a piece of that. And as I just said, Scope 3 includes all the suppliers' emissions that are coming on the kind of upstream. So that means over time, this will essentially trickle down. That's how I see it. And as a supplier ourselves, who work with large companies, we have started actually being asked to start measuring our own emissions as a small business within the next couple of years. So I know this both kind of theoretically, it feels likely this will happen, but also from experience. So really quickly to hit on the importance of commuting. This is a study that came out of the East Coast, I think it was Boston. They found that transportation energy is now exceeding operating energy in an average building in the United States by 16%. So that's energy of the transportation coming into and out of the building is more than the energy of the building itself. Kind of to what Ali said, companies are getting really good and real estate is getting really good at net zero or close to net zero buildings from using solar and wind power. And so it's now the transportation that's much harder. This is a company we've worked with. It's a large tech company with offices across the globe, mostly in North America. But they actually have measured their emissions for a few years, and commuting accounts for 10% of their total emissions. They're a tech company, so right, they don't have a lot of manufacturing, or really none at all. So that's why commuting is pretty significant for them, but it's important to talk about. And you see the same in other industries as well. So this is another company we've worked with, a financial institution, about 2,000 employees or so. Their emissions they have a similar story to the kind of case study that Ali was walking through earlier, where starting in 2017, they really put a focus towards how do we reduce our emissions. And what you can see is that, well, it's sort of hard to see here because this is in percentage, but they dramatically dropped the emissions of energy use on the premises and their other scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That's in the pink and purple here. At the same time, they really didn't put much focus on commuting. So they reduced business travel. They focused a lot on their suppliers. They've worked a lot on energy efficient buildings. They kind of almost completely reduced or removed paper from their entire supply chain. And they did a really good job and have really reduced their emissions quite significantly. Commuting was just something they didn't think about, and they're now starting to think about it about a year ago. So you can see throughout that entire kind of process, even, I think this is important, even when they started doing kind of remote work during the pandemic, the difference between this one and this one, commuting still stays above the other two. So commuting now accounts for almost 50% of their entire emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. So pretty dramatic. Specifically talking about how do we actually go out there and collect the information. There's a lot of good tools and more tools that are coming on the market, which is incredible to see. But if you were to do this alone, some things that are good to know. If you were just to go try to collect all this data, minimum, how are people traveling to an office site or to a job site? How are they doing it, and how often? That's the minimum you need to know. Preferably, as Ali said, you have more details. What type of vehicle are they driving? How many people are in that vehicle? What mode of transit is different between a bus and a train, for instance? Over time, I see this getting even more complex, where we start talking about electric vehicles. An EV charged on the grid is not the same as charged by solar, unless your grid's fully solar. And as Larry mentioned at the beginning, work from home emissions are very optional, I'd say. Almost no one I've ever talked to counts it in their scope 3 commuting emissions, but there are some. So it's probably going to become a bigger thing over time. At Commutifi, we're trying to help make sure that the data being collected is accurate. It's doing the right thing. It's helping us get to the right kind of measurements. So the traditional way to measure emissions is through self-reported data, through surveys. This is still the primary way to measure emissions. It's the easiest way to get information about how people are coming into the office. But progressively, we're getting towards the right, where we get to connected data. That's essentially pulling data from third-party sources. I like to say this all the time. Someone somewhere knows what you did and knows what you're doing right now. It's just about using that data for good and not for, like, I don't know, weirdly tracking you on your phone. So over time, I think this data will become more accessible to use in these types of reports. And then what we're really hoping to get to is what I call evolving data. So a survey gives you one moment in time, and you have to survey consistently to continue to see that change. Connected data can kind of help you with that, but evolving data tells you what's going on almost on a daily basis. So you can really see granularly how you're improving your emissions. Evolving data exists in almost all of the other environmental kind of disciplines. Scope 1 emissions, if you think about energy usage of your building, the people behind the scenes putting solar and checking how it's doing at a corporate campus are able to see almost in real time how many megawatts of electricity are coming from the solar panels versus the grid. We need to get there with transportation, but we're still pretty far away. So there's some kind of standard calculations. I like to throw this up there in case you're just like taking notes and you're talking to a company, or you yourself are a company, you're trying to make calculations. I think you'll have access to these slides, so I won't go through it specifically. One of the big things to talk about is active modes of transportation. They're pretty much zero, technically, in e-bike charges, but it's so minimal. And then when we talk about vehicle-based emissions, the number of passengers has a huge impact, and I'll get to that in a second. I think also critically, talking about how your data is actually going to be reviewed. So if you are an organization or you're working with an organization putting together reporting on how your scope 3 category 7 employee commuting emissions are doing, there's really 4 different categories or 4 different groups of people looking at it. Internal stakeholders. So I just realized I wrote stakeholders, but yeah, forgive me. Internal stakeholders are looking at, how do you, this is, your sustainability leads, your chief sustainability officers, even the C-suite more and more. I also am including investors in this group. It's just really, ESG is an investor-driven idea, particularly at least in the United States. Investors and banks are more and more wanting to invest in green companies. So this is something that's being looked at internally. Most companies are starting to do third-party audits. We've just completed going through one with a financial institution, which is really fun. It's a lot of fun accounting. So, people will put kind of a magnifying glass on every single kind of assumption you make. So just being able to back that up is really important. There's increasingly voluntary certifications, like LEED certifications, that are taking into account transportation into buildings. I think this is going to continue to grow. And then obviously regulatory bodies, as we see in California or the European Union. So just kind of bringing that all together, that's the background, similar to what the other speakers were talking about. It's key to be able to take all of your data and bring it together. This is something Commutifi helps with. So we're working with how can you centralize and contextualize all the data, whether that's from surveys, that's from third-party technologies you're using, that's from your own parking system, or just from spreadsheets that you've been meticulously keeping. Like identifying insights. I like to talk a lot about data, insights, action. So companies and people love to jump straight into action. It sometimes works. It's just throwing a dart blind. You might hit it, you might not. Doing the data and insights first is key. I think it's easy to a little easier to conceptualize numbers for an individual than numbers for an organization. So I'll pick on Larry here. Let's assume he drives himself to work 15 miles each way, 5 days a week. The current average single occupancy vehicle, current average vehicle in North America, that would be about 6,000 pounds. Apologies to my friends across the pond who want to see this in non-imperial metric units, but bear with me, 6,000 pounds of CO2 annually. If Larry buys a cleaner car, let's say a hybrid, you cut that down to about 2,800 pounds. Pretty significant, but it does require him to literally purchase a new car. If he starts taking a bus, and these numbers are skewed because the United States bus system's fairly dirty and not that well used, the average bus in the United States cuts down almost equivalent to switching to a hybrid, depending on where you are. That said, in certain regions, this is much more significant. So certainly, like, we do a lot of work in Vancouver. Vancouver's got an incredibly clean green bus system. This is down below 1,000 pounds. for that individual. But if we look at carpooling as an option, the nice thing about carpooling is that it doesn't require you to purchase a new vehicle. It doesn't require you to take a new route. All it requires you to do is find someone to carpool with. And the beauty of it is that it actually has a continuing building effect. So putting a second person in that car brings you to almost the same impact as switching to a hybrid, adopting a bus commute, but you have more opportunity to add a third, a fourth person in that car over time. You can really drive those emissions down. This is kind of what Ali was saying. If we take that 50-mile commute and we shrink it and we focus it down on putting 2 people in it, you've just turned 2 50-mile commutes into 1 50-mile commute. You're really cutting quite a lot out. It is important to engage and educate everyone on this. I think the reason I used to be doing stuff in renewable energy, the reason I got into transportation is because it's a whole behavior change problem. It's really interesting. It's a big problem. This is why companies are struggling with figuring out their scope 3 category 7 emissions and how to reduce it, because they don't have direct ownership over what happens. They can suggest, they can support, they can almost even punish people for driving alone by charging more for parking, but they can't tell them what to do, at least not in most places. So it is important to educate, engage commuters on helping them make the best choices. A lot of people don't even realize the impact of their own trip on the environment. And along those lines as well, incentivizing and rewarding commutes is really important. So this is something that we're seeing, we're doing more and more with organizations, is actually dynamically rewarding people for taking sustainable commutes, or giving people kind of allowances to better access other trips. The reality in the United States is most employers do not charge for parking at their job sites. The best thing you can do is charge for parking. That's my opinion. If you charge for parking, you'll get people to stop driving alone. But in the absence of that, you can use the carrot versus the stick approach, and you can just provide better rewards for folks. Particularly important for low-income individuals and shift workers. I think, at least in the United States, TDM tends to be kind of the conversation driven around tech companies and big organizations with a ton of money, with highly paid individuals who work there, more as an employee perk. But if you get more into the manufacturing jobs, the hospital jobs, the retail jobs, access to a car is not a given, even in the United States. And so providing this support is really important. So I end every presentation about ESG and sustainability the same way. TDM, transportation demand management. I think a lot of people think, hey, dealing with the demand on our transportation is an opportunity for us to be more sustainable. But I flip that on its head and we say ESG or sustainability is an opportunity for TDM. This is actually really driving the conversation globally, but also in North America. And if you are a TDM professional, it's important to kind of understand what's happening in the space and take advantage of it. More and more companies that we're working with are getting budgets approved through sustainability versus through the traditional kind of modes that they had before. So we also have an ebook if you want to scan that QR code, or this will get sent out to everyone if you want to read a little bit more on that, and feel free to reach out to me as well. And I'm excited to get to questions because I want to stop hearing myself talk and hear what other people have to say.
Well,
thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Andy. We love to hear you talk. So it was very interesting. Thanks, Andy. That was everyone gave a tremendous presentation. So I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative and just maybe ask a question of Parnika and then Ali and Andy as well. I just want to ask first, Parnika, you talked about materiality in your work. And I noticed that the SEC's rule that was just promulgated said that companies have to do things for scope 1 and 2 if they consider it material. So how does this work? Does a company have to make that determination, as a threshold determination in their emissions reporting, or is there some standard that that has to be followed to validate that something is material or not material?
Thank you, Larry. Yes, in terms of like materiality, there used to be this so-called single materiality, but now there's this double materiality, which is kicked in with the new reporting. There is no standard as such. I think each company decides on its ESG narrative, as far as I understand. Please correct me, anybody in the audience, if I'm wrong. You have to have your ESG narrative based on what is what is the most important for the company in terms of what is important to your investors and your stakeholders. And stakeholders can be your clients, but they can also be the civil society at large, or even your own employees. And based on that ESG narrative, I think it's also then for companies to determine, and really using this tool to find out, where they're identify the risks and the opportunities. And then when you identify your risks, you also find out, how do you then, action on these risks. So this is the way I understand materiality. Like it's an assessment tool, and you really it provides the criteria to determine whether whether a topic is a risk for your company or not, and then work on that. So that would be my answer.
Okay.
There's not a tool. There is no standard as such, as I understand.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then for Ali and Andy, as a TDM professional, for many years, the TDM sort of outreach was to companies saying, we'll help you with your productivity or retention or recruitment and those kind of things. Is it totally shifted now in terms of your interactions or companies coming to you? Are they not talking about that anymore? Is it purely now emissions reporting and reduction, or are you somehow in transition?
I mean, from our side, it still is the old conversation as well as emissions too. I mean, it was very interesting when our government just last year suddenly said, actually, we don't need to be quite so worried about hitting our net zero goals. We're on track. Public sector bodies, you don't need to really worry about it because we're going to hit them anyway. Literally overnight, the market stalled. Lots of projects were in flight. The NHS was one. The rate of uptake from NHS hospitals was far quicker when the government, before the government made that statement. It's picking back up again now, but the old reasons for doing this are still there. Some companies do still have parking problems, but recruitment and retention, I don't know what the job market's like in the States, but in the UK, it is hard work finding good recruits, and having a good commuter plan, a good sustainable commuter plan helps with that massively. Helping also the surveys. So a lot of the surveys we're doing are asking employees what they want to do. How often do they want to work from home? How often do they want to be in the office? Where do they want to be based? Those insights are really useful to HR teams trying to recruit more staff. And when we're working with big logistics firms, when they come up to their peak around Christmas, they are desperately trying to get people in. And unless they have decent like TDM plans, they can't get the staff. So it is business critical. And so I'd say right now, although the environmental side has given us people to talk to who are often now much more empowered than they were 5 years ago, they've often got budgets and they need to do this internally. The key benefits to the companies are still seen as helping basically recruit staff and getting people into work.
Yep, I'd pretty much say the same. I think we see conversation going two ways. Often it starts at sustainability. So there's a sustainability person in the company who says, hey, this is great. Let's look into it. And it sometimes sort of stalls there. They say, it's not my budget, it's HR's budget. When you go to HR does, they might personally care about sustainability, but their job mission is not. So you need both pitches. But I've seen it come the other way as well, where you're talking to the traditional facilities folks or real estate folks about it, and they're like, I can't find the budget. And then there's budget from sustainability that drives that. So almost, particularly as you're talking about large organizations with 2,000 plus employees, which is a lot of who we work with, you rarely are talking one value prop. You need at least two before you get enough people at the table that the investment will happen. I like to say commuting is a tertiary sort of benefit. It's not helping produce the product. It's not helping improve processes to improve the product. It's helping improve ways to get the people to improve ways to build the product, to sell the product. So it's deep down the line for most people, but sustainability is now giving us at least a new pitch that is being heard. So it adds to all the things that we had and kind of helps push that down the line a bit.
Just Larry, going back to your first question about materiality, I think it is up to us as a sector to really make the case that commuting is material. The pandemic really helped with that. When people couldn't commute, suddenly offices and businesses struggled. So if you don't have commuters, you don't have workers. And therefore, the commute is material financially and impact-wise. And we have to make a really clear case for that, because then it will be included in all these emissions reports. But unless we do, it is in danger of being forgotten about, because people, just as Andy was saying, it's not direct, but it is it is the biggest supplier to most businesses is your commute workforce. So you've got to make sure they can get to work.
Yeah,
Great.
and if I can jump in there, it's also, I mean, so a lot of the companies that I'm looking at, or they're publicly listed, sort of, their CDP reporting, there's a lot of estimates being made there in terms of, just 3 days a week, X distance, or they look at the spend-based method, which is how much they've spent, and then calculate instead of a distance-based or a fuel-based. So I think there's all these estimates going in there, and for many companies, employee commuting may not be their greatest source of emissions. So that's being forgotten. At least that's what I see with the energy companies or the logistics companies that I work with. And so a lot of more focus is on freight, for example, or all the manufacturing or all the products, et cetera, et cetera. So somehow I feel like employee commuting is not on the list of priorities, and therefore it's not considered as material and not in the ESG narrative as much as it should be.
Yeah.
So
But if those freight drivers can't get to work, then it becomes very material.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody have a question? I want to hog this myself. Vivek?
So I just want to echo something that I think Andy said at the very beginning. This has been fabulous. I mean, all of these events are wonderful, and I have probably the steepest learning curve during this hour every month. So thank you all very much. I basically just had a question. It's unfortunately, Larry, not directly related to Scope 3, but certainly indirectly. In terms of carpooling, and my colleague Holden Hume is also on this, we're building a carpooling platform that we hope will scale up and make an impact. But I'm really interested in the whole problem, which we call the stranded problem. And to what extent Ali and Andy and anybody else, to what extent that was a factor or a challenge in maybe limiting the adoption and usage of the services the solutions that you provided when you were, up and running pre-pandemic. How big a factor was that in people deciding not to carpool with others? Thanks.
I didn't understand that question very much. You said something about stranded. I didn't get you. Could you clarify what you mean, please?
Sure. So the stranded problem, as I understand it, is, people who own cars and can easily use them as SOVs, deciding to continue to do so. It perpetuates itself because it's subsidized, but also because they just don't know if they're going to change their plans during the day, if they're going to be held up at work for an extra half an hour. It's just too big a risk factor. And so if you don't get massive penetration along their route and at both ends of their route, which is itself a very big lift for most startups, how big a problem was that for some earlier efforts? That's really my question. Thanks.
So from our side, I vividly remember one of my first client meetings with a science park just outside Cambridge, and they brought that very topic up. I say, what happens when suddenly the lift isn't there? And they'd just done their travel survey, and they had about 10% of people already sharing cars to get into work. And I said, how many of them come to you when they've got a problem? And they said, well, they don't come to us. Well, what do? Well, they sort it out themselves, and that is exactly what people do. But normally, with our system, like many of them, there's a whole list of other people you can go with. Some clients offer guaranteed ride home, where they pay for a taxi if you need to travel home in emergency. Tiny budgets are needed for that. Literally a handful of people will use it each year, but it's areas of backup. But in terms of what people do, you always have a backup. You know in your mind, if you can't get home, or you need to get home early, you can either get a taxi or you get to live with someone else or whatever. So it's a perceived problem. It often comes up during like tenders or the early part of the work, but in reality, it's not really a problem. It is a barrier to some people taking it up. You think before you carpool, why, like, I'm going to have problems with this, but actually when people start carpooling, they generally carry on. I think our retention rate's about 88-89% of people who start sharing now will be sharing in a year, because you overcome all those barriers. You find ways, and actually having to leave work on time is often a very nice thing. So if you have to leave work because your carpool is going, like, it's quite nice to say to your boss, sorry, I've got to go home and see my family.
I think you hit that right on, hit the nail on the head there, Ali. I mean, that's, you do need some level of supply. There's a supply demand kind of issue here. If you have too much demand, no supply, it's not going to work. I think it is critical at the start of any sort of deployment is what I've seen is that the first time someone kind of logs in, either downloads an app, logs in to some sort of database, if they can't find a match, you might lose them, and you might lose them forever, or you might lose them for 6 months. You can kind of, you have to continue to engage them. So it's important to have that group at the beginning. There's certainly like any sort of technology adoption, there's going to be early adopters and late adopters, and if you had everyone carpooling and it's the company culture, then more people are going to carpool. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. The best thing I've ever heard, I think building the company culture is important. The best example I've heard is a company, I think it was 2 decades ago, that actually in their lunch line at their cafeteria had a carpool only, like a HOV lane for you to go and get your food. And if you carpooled in, you could go in the HOV lane to get your food first. And it increased carpooling rate like dramatically, because people were coming to lunch and they're like, why am I having to wait in line? Yeah. They can look to the side and their friends are like, hey, you can join my carpool, you can jump in line. So I've never heard anyone else do it. I've tried to convince companies to, but if someone can figure it out, that was the best example I ever heard.
That's brilliant. I love that.
Yeah. But I will say also from a TDM perspective, my company runs a statewide program. We consider this friction, where it's another thing people will think of not to do something because it's a barrier. And so what we do is we offer a guaranteed ride home program. Virtually all our companies in our program do that. And we hardly get anybody ever using it. I mean, we offer it to everybody. And it's minuscule. It's probably mostly used for other modes as opposed to carpooling. So I think we find it's good to just say we do it. And so people can't raise it as, oh, I can't do it because of an emergency. What am I going to do? But in reality, it's not used at all. They don't really need it.
Turns out, if I may contribute, John, there's some research that shows that a big reason that people like to own cars is that in their minds there are rare emergency situations. Talking about having children, and you might have to take your kid to the emergency room in the middle of the night. You want to be able to do that. Now, does it happen every week, every month? No. But the fact that it's there, it's a huge benefit of being a car owner. I'm just saying, it's kind of like that. So I think what Larry is saying, that the guaranteed ride home, and I've heard this for years, doesn't really cost you very much. But can we agree that it could be just a huge benefit to make it very, very clear if you come to work on the bus, and the boss says you've got to get this project done. Okay, so it's 10 o'clock at night, and the buses don't run very well at 10 o'clock at night. You get you don't have to get special permission. You just do it and turn in the chip, and you get paid. So I think it's a really interesting point.
This is Phil. I'd like to add one thing is making sure you're talking to the customers to get an idea what's important. A lot of the emergency ride home programs are basically duplicates of what everybody else is doing, and they're really just set up for 3 or 4 times a year, typically. We did a focus group years ago, and we were asking people why they didn't carpool. And the TMA at the time had an emergency ride home program that allotted up to 4 rides a year. And the response of the focus group, oh, that's not enough, even though they never used it or would probably never use it. So the question is if 4 is not enough and it's not being used, make it 12, 1 a month or something like that. Enough to kind of go, okay, now I feel comfortable with that. And this is obviously pre-Uber, pre-Lyft, et cetera. There are a lot of, and then I think a lot of programs actually reimburse a coworker for driving you home, or is another alternative, so you don't have to use a paid service. But talking to the customer is probably really important nowadays. More important nowadays.
Let's see, I have a question on emissions and talked about target setting. I know, Ali, at one point you had mentioned that it helps the company reach their target. How do you help companies set their emissions targets in the commuting area? And if so, how do you do that? And then, Arnika, from your point of view, do these regulations or reporting requirements, do they have any target setting protocols that have to be followed in order to comply with these regulations or requirements?
Okay, so yes, we definitely advise companies on what we think is possible using. If you remember those two tools I showed earlier, we've got the ASIL tool and the ASLO tool. Well, the ASLO shows you what you could get to tomorrow if everyone travels sustainably, and it shows that you don't have to do much to start getting those percentages down. What ASIL does is, because it's an average score per person, it doesn't matter if your company grows in numbers, staff numbers, or declines, but the average has got, you need to get the average down. So if you've got a 2040 net zero goal, and you know what your emissions are now, you can work out the percentage reduction you need each year on average to get down there. And typically it's about 5, so in some cases, if we've got a short-term net zero goal, it could be 10% a year. That decline is typically what we got during the pandemic. So that's a level of change we've got to get to, which gets people thinking, what do we need to do right now? And obviously getting, in the case that I showed earlier, getting 300 staff to share cars out of 1,000, that's getting them more than 10% below where they were the year before. So they're up on their target. So we typically say aim for a minimum of 5% reduction a year in your ASIL score. But if you can go further, faster, do, because it'll make that journey easier later on. It also gets people to prioritize what they're putting their effort into. So one very large global company that we've all heard of, we're going to focus a lot of effort on their getting EVs. That was going to be, they were going to have an EV strategy to decarbonize their commute. Their staff can't afford EVs. So they were going down the wrong strategy. But as soon as they saw the data, they could say, actually, what we need to be doing is encouraging active travel and public transport where we can, but a big push on commute shuttles, carpooling in the short term, 2 to 3 years, and then we'll look at EVs 4 or 5 years down the line when they've got a lot cheaper.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. And that EV story, I think that's a very common EV story. Like many companies we work with say, hey, we're gonna get everyone to use EVs, and in the survey that you send out to employees, you say, we've had one that just says, give us any feedback you want, and over 50% of people wrote in, I can't afford an EV, why are you pushing EVs on me? It wasn't even prompted. So it almost had a negative impact. People were less likely to, pay attention and trust the company and what they were trying to do, because they felt they were asking for something that was just completely unreasonable. So it's an interesting anecdote.
Yeah, Arnika, any thoughts on the standard setting with targets?
Yeah. So that's an interesting point both Andy and raised. But I think with the standard setting for now, what I've seen is that a lot of the reporting was voluntary, and now with CSRD, it's going to start getting certain things will start getting more. They're mandatory by law. So within that, of course, there is no specific. I mean, a company sets its own net zero target, or whether they set a baseline and or an intermediate target of what they want to achieve. So that's pretty much voluntary. But what I do see is investor pressure. So when companies start reporting, whether they're reporting to CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, or if they're using a science-based target initiative to report on their, to set a target in line with that SBTi criteria and report, there is definitely pressure. And that's what I see from the corporate partners boards, without naming any companies. So if one company has a certain disclosure which shows higher emissions, whereas another company for the same criteria has lower emissions, then there is questions raised by their investors and by civil society or NGOs as to why one has more than the other. And this is where I think the grumblings start coming in. Oh, but we are using different emissions factors because our supply chains are so complex, or maybe one is manufacturing something in China or another one is in France. So I think there is a lot more complexity. There's emissions factors which are different for different reasons because of how electricity is produced, et cetera, et cetera. Won't get into that. But generally, I think this is where companies want to see some more standardization or harmonization. So everyone's reporting about the same things in the same way and not using different estimates, and which means that at some point, one is reporting more or less, or that's the perception at least. So I think there is some work to be done around that.
I see Heidi has her hand up.
Yeah, sorry. Yep, got it. So we are hearing kind of internally that commute emissions are pretty low compared to some of our other scope 3 supplier emissions. And so I'm wondering if with either of these, some of these reporting tools, commute tools, would it be possible to use the tool as well to calculate supplier commute emission or supplier emissions, maybe even as a way to sell the purchase and in implementation of it for commuting, or would that kind of mess up all of your data? I guess I'm just thinking like, how to sell it and make it relevant for something more than just commuting, which we're hearing is pretty small, especially post-pandemic. And I guess for Andy, for the tool, for sort of the commute emissions tools that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I know the issue is, so there are tools out there that will measure all of your scope 3 emissions, and they make fairly broad assumptions across the board. That's the challenge. And generally the assumptions being made, I think Parnika might have mentioned this, assumptions being made by sort of high level where you just say, hey, our average employee probably is this far away and probably is doing X, Y, Z. So they tend to, well, not always, but they will often undercount kind of the actual impact. So what we've noticed is honestly just getting that number of like, let me just put it all in. How many metric tons of CO2 are from emissions? Like really getting it, putting it in front of the sustainability team almost always shocks them. Like, particularly, I know you're coming from a tech company. It's probably higher than they think it is. At some point, they will look at it. The other piece from the kind of pitching this to the leadership that I see is if you have a goal, like I said, a net zero type goal, emissions from commuting will at some point come up. So in the past, we've had conversations with companies. They say, commuting's too small. We're not going to do it. And then 2-3 years later, I get a call and they're like, hey, so it turns out we have no idea what we're doing on commute emissions. And now they're way bigger than everything else. And we're not prepared. And now we're falling behind our goals. So it's a hard pitch, but somehow being able to kind of pitch that, maybe even if it's smaller percentage wise, it's still the impact's big, but it requires investment that's a little different than what the sustainability team is used to doing. I don't know, Ali, if you have any other opinions on that.
Yeah, so interesting. So commuting, when it's bundled in with scope 3, for some particularly manufacturing companies can seem relatively small, but it often is larger than scope 1 or scope 2, or some of the key elements of scope 1 or scope 2, so such as energy emissions in the office or those things. So trying to make it relevant to things other than scope 3. I mean, I personally think that commuting should have always been scope 2, because it is something that every employer has a role in how their staff get to work, as proven during the pandemic. So it is often relevant but it depends on what you compare it to. In terms of getting suppliers to do this, we actually have one of our biggest clients now looking at getting all their clients to adopt ASIL as their standard metric for reporting their commute emissions, because they see it as a way they can support their supply base in starting to track one of their key emissions. So they are interested in the overall data, but it's just a way of them reaching out to them. The other thing with commuting is it's one thing that impacts on employees, and employees can get involved with and support and play a part in, whereas many Scope 3 emissions are something that the workforce literally can't do anything about. They have no role in that at all, whereas the commute is something they very much can. And when you look at all these workplace surveys, employees want to be involved in this, and they want things that they can do, and the commute is definitely one thing that they can be involved in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We are tracking commute emissions, and it still isn't very big in comparison to some of the other things that are out there. So, but I do think that's a really good point, and it points to the behavioral change aspect as well. And people are all very passionate about their commute and transportation, so that's what keeps us here, huh? Thank you.
Yeah. And I would like to add to that, saying that I think sometimes employees don't realize that they can contribute to Scope 3, because when you say Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, it's quite sort of something, that's something companies do, or it's not something that employees can contribute to. So I think sometimes that's quite a revelation as well for employees to say that, okay, there's something that they can be a part of.
Absolutely.
I wanted to do two things. I mean, I want to recognize the speakers, Larry, for the job of moderating, and the speakers for great content today. This is, I think, met the objectives we had for the session quite well, very, very well. I did pick up what I thought was an interesting point, and I thought, well, that's a hugely important point, is linking the benefit for the company to spending money on a program to reduce commute emissions, because it doesn't immediately look like it saves money for the company. But I've heard a couple of things that you've said. The one is recruitment attraction. The other might be about employee or staff satisfaction. But I think there's another really huge one that's real cash for the company, and that is reduced parking costs. If you're paying for parking for your staff, then all of a sudden you could start to reduce that cost. And so I think you can create a story that links back to a cost benefit. A real thanks to Parnika. It's great to have the European context in our conversations. We do call ourselves an international organization, and it's really excellent that we got the support from ITF to join in with this conversation. And all of you have colleagues around the world that might find this interesting. We will release the recording of this and the presentations very, very shortly. Share them with folks and encourage people to join in as well in our conversations. Larry, I'll pass it back to you with all those things said. Is there any last points?
I want to add my thanks to Parnika, Ali, and Andy. It was really fascinating. The presentations were great, and we will share those presentations because I think a lot of people will be interested in having them, as well as those who weren't able to attend. So I want to thank everyone for their participation, and the audience was great. So thank you for being part of the conversation.
One last chance, raise your hand, unmute yourself and say something if you'd like to add anything, please. Anybody?
I just wanted to reiterate how valuable this hour always is, or 90 minutes. So thank you all. And just to add to the comments that Paul was making a moment ago, in terms of the benefits that employers would have, I mean, for me, one of the huge intangible benefits is social cohesion amongst the employee base. I mean, what a wonderful thing it is to commute with a fellow employee in a totally different context to the workspace, right? You're in a vehicle together. And I think that's truly an intangible benefit that, you know, by definition can't be measured as many other benefits can. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Vivek.
Good point.
Okay, well, thank you.
Oh, yep. Round of applause. Yep.
Thank you, and have a great day for everybody, or evening if that's your time zone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Good fun.